Hannah Morgan-Cross. Hannah Cross is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Westminster. She's a member, former chair of the editorial working group of the Review of African Political Economy. She's also a founding member of the International Initiative for Promoting Political Economy, Africa, working group DAO. Publications to aggression, order, global capitalism, West African labor mobility, and EU border positions. That was published in 2019, and Migration Beyond African Policy of 2021. We welcome Hannah Cross. Immediately next to her is a colleague of mine, Dr. Marian Atieno Uma. Obviously, as you see, Atieno, it means Kenya, isn't it? The Kenya, South African. Marian Uma is a research associate with the South African Research Initiative on Social Policy at the University of South Africa, where she also completed a PhD. Both her bachelor's and master's degree are from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. She was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Nordic Africa Institute, Starlight student, and has been a visiting fellow at the University of Beirut in Germany. Her research interests include social policy, protection, policy making, and political economy for partners development. There's African critical policy, African development, chapters, and African economics. That's a book she called with the views gentlemen. And so you want to the handbook of the African political economy and social policy in African context has written several op-eds, including in Africa is the country and trade continental. Africa is seen to be across the country. May we welcome Marian. And lastly, do not least, she's an American, or European, give away. We have with us Professor Eric Timoy. French, I'm not very good with French. Eric Timoy is an associate professor of economics at the Lewis and Clark College, Portland, Oregon, and research associate at the Levy Economics Institute for Bard College. You know, Levy Institute, very, very credible place for heterodox economics. His areas of teaching and research include macroeconomics, money and banking, and of course, monetary economics. May we welcome Eric, please. So we're going to have the presentation. It's 10 minutes each. I hope that get stuck. That I see that the presentation is on. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. So I'm here to talk about, to learn a lot from this conference I've been playing. And I need to talk about how to use monetary sovereignty to help economic development. Yeah. So what are the opportunities and the constraints of the economy with monetary sovereignty? And if you're a monetary sovereign, is agreement on just do whatever you want, right? Print your way out of your problems, or you have to think about policy making in a way that we put some constraints, but maybe different constraints than you have when you don't have monetary sovereignty. So we'll first look at what monetary sovereignty is, its purpose, and move to using that for economic development. So one of the way that is usually understood, when we talk about line service, we usually do have immediate people. Just a little bit, like, you're printing money to spend, and so taxing that would become necessary. And pushes in careless spending on lavish programs. It subjugates the central bank to the will of the treasury, when they're independent. And so if you have monetary sovereignty, you're gonna run large deficits. Here we have examples, the quantitative easing. So basically, monetary sovereignty is supposed to be the road to ruin, except maybe for the United States. Can get away with it because there's a foreign demand for currency. Okay, so what I'm going to try to show here is that this understanding of what monetary sovereignty is and how to use it is quite incorrect. My main argument would be that you can apply it to any countries, not crucial to the United States. So what are the main characteristics of monetary sovereignty? So you first set and enforce monetary laws, you define what your unit of account is, you have tender laws, rules of the payment system, rules of debt discharge, okay? Then issue an convertible national currency, that's what gives you the greatest flexibility. Now you can have a convertible currency, but be able to use your monetary sovereignty. In that case, you're gonna have to quite an expensive amount of reserves. Okay. Then you issue public debt denominated in that currency, and you tax in the national currency. And so some governments are closer to that than others. So when did monetary sovereignty emerge? Well, monetary systems are old. The modern forms of them, 5,000 years ago. Okay. And the point was to compel the population to move resources toward the government authority. And it's usually tax driven, that means it involves it's establishing an asymmetric power relation. Okay, where you impose dues that have to be paid in the national currency, and so others become indebted to the sovereign by law. Okay. And the sovereign promises to basically accept its currency as a means of paying for the tax that are okay. And of course, there are negative consequences if taxes are not paid. So a sovereign that will not willingly or can't enforce the payment of dues will see its sovereignty challenged. And so that creates problems to move domestic resources for the public purpose. So what are some of those challenges? So if you have an unstable political system, then you have a lack of trust in the ability or willingness of the government to enforce the tax payments. If you have poor enforcement mechanisms, like large tax evasion, corruption of tax officials, that's another problem. But limit the ability to redeem the national currency taxation. You can track economic transactions, and you have large informal sectors. That will also diminish the ability to use the national domestic system to move resources for the public service. Now, some sovereigns have political power that extend beyond their own territory, and in that case, it's easier to move resources even far beyond national domestic resources. For a lot of developing economies, they have the issue of first making sure that there is enough demand in their country to be the public services state. How is that monetary sovereignty implemented? Well, what we just see is that the traditional argument is that the central bank is supposed to be dependent on the treasury, and the central bank is only involved in monetary policy, and the treasury is only involved with fiscal policy. What you observe in reality for a sovereign monetary sovereign government is that there's heavy coordination, financial coordination between the two entities. Okay, so the central bank is heavily involved in fiscal policy, not as an exception, but as a routine. Okay. It directly finances the treasury either by participating in the auctions or by financing the participants that are required to bid in all auctions. Okay. And the treasury itself is also involved in monetary policy because government spending and taxes influence the monetary base. And when the central bank targets an interest rate, it needs to neutralize the impact of this change in the monetary rate coming from the fiscal side. And at times it requires the involvement of the treasury for reasons I don't have time to develop. So in that case, you don't have financial constraints on transactions done in the domestic currency. So you can afford to buy anything for sale as long as it's denominated in your own currency. Here it is in 1940, the government which has control over the banking and currency system can always find the cash to pay for its purchases of home purchase goods. So it's clearly talking about the next resource. Government cannot force default on debt denominated in its own currency. It's purely voluntary. And so in that case, you have control over the cost of your public debt. And it's basically set through monetary policy. And what you observe too is that the public debt is managed for other reasons than pure budgetary reasons. We observe that treasuries that are fiscal surplus will still issue public debt. Or at times, the central bank will ask the treasury to issue public debt for monetary policy purposes. So the public debt does not move for pure budgetary reasons. It's managed for others. And so with that, then that changes the way you do policy making when you manage domestic resources. If the question is no longer where are we going to find the money, how we're going to pay for it, rather, first you have to ask yourself, what do you want government to do in your country? So the political question answer. And here there are many socioeconomic challenges where the government can help and employment and okay. And the point is that none of them, as long as you only use domestic resources of your financial aid, savings, social security, business can go bankrupt. No, the government can pay for simple security. The problem is not financial, the problem is more ratio of employability and of non-labor people. So that is about raising the activity, training, not about putting money in laptops. So to pay, we just credit the accounts and we've done in 2 seconds. And you have to set, of course, your tax structure and spending priorities to meet these challenges. And so the first thing is to determine what your constraints are. So here you can look at 2 questions. First one is, are resource suppliers unable or unwilling to sell to the government goods and services priced in domestic currency? Yes or no. Second one is, can the government run out of money? Yes or no. And so if you answer no to both questions, then there are no constraints. If you have yes to both, then you have both financial and real constraints. So you have to determine where you are within that space. The second set of questions concerns how to do policy. The first one is, how should you judge the soundness of the policy's proposal? So here you have 3 criteria. You have the sound finance pay-go metrics. So deficits are intrinsically bad. They reflect insolvency. The government is like a household. And so you have to balance your budget. The other one is functional finance. You look at what the program you want to do and how it's going to impact the economy. And soundness is based on, does your program achieve whatever it is you want to do? And then you have financial practice, which is that the Treasury and the Treasury and Central Bank coordinate. They coordinate get different response. So most government today are heavy coordination. And they use sound finance. So I noticed here that we have heard sometimes coordinate, but you use functional finance metrics, resource metrics, but then legal metrics. So that's the other thing. Now, the unlimited capacity to pay doesn't mean that the government should spend an unlimited amount to account for station risks, waste. So first goal is to decide what you want to do. Okay, decide by how much you want to renew the mission. What should be the speed, the pace of spending. When it's consistent with that goal, estimate the resource need. Okay, if resources are not available, can you make them available or not? And so that will determine the pace at which you can spend. Okay. But at no point the discussion about how much spending is going to be about when you raise the revenue to match the spending. Okay. And trying to balance the budget. The fiscal balance is basically not under the control of government because you have automatic stabilizers that are going to work against you. If you are a policymaker and you come and you're elected to the budget committee, you'll see very quickly that most spending is non-discretionary. And taxes, you have absolutely zero impact. You can set the tax rate, but you cannot set the revenue people earn that is dependent on the business stuff. And so the fiscal balance will do whatever it needs to do, okay? And you have no control of it, you can decide how to collapse and how to spend. So I'll move quickly to how that plays out to manage domestic resources. So the first thing you have to do is expand the demand for the currency, okay? And so you have to increase the reach of taxation by better tracking informal sectors. So set up a payment system in such a way that you can track payments that are made in the informal sector. And we have an example of that in India recently. You try to target to use the unused resources. You don't want to compete with private sector. You want to use unused resources, unemployed teachers, unemployed builders, unused wood, whatever resources you have domestically to increase your productive capacities. And the point is to do the most with what you have on the home soil first. Okay? And so try to develop projects that use little to no foreign input. Okay. So work on that. Now, or if you have to use external resources, okay, so here the broad point is you want to have developed collaborations. We have heard a lot about that in the presentation. Have a more solidarity approach, okay, and a broad approach where you try to develop import substitutes for key strategy, for key activities. You have the capital and trade control needed, so you want to make sure that the amount of reserve you have is directed toward the critical sectors you want to develop. You want to work with partners to develop exchange of resources so that if you have a difference, you can trade on that based on bilateral trade, exchange of complementary skills, and go as far as the end of World War II style one-way transfer. Okay, from the United States at the end of the war, basically the United States provided one-way transfer to Europe and rebuild Europe, which can cancel public. So, and avoid issuing public debt and eliminating with foreign currency. So the overall logic is summarized in this small graph. So the dark orange area are all your potential domestic resources that are available. Okay, and for a lot of developing economies, the problem is that monetary sovereignty needs to be able to expand it and to be able to use all domestic resources by creating a greater demand for the national currency. And once you're there, then you have external resources that you require. So there are collaborations, export promotion, and import stuff. Thank you.
Pretty much in time. Thanks, Derek. So, anyone? Beat the record, I suppose. Thanks very much. 5 minutes.
So I'll talk about the need for Africa to integrate social and economic policy. And to do this, I look at the various frameworks on the continent, like the African Union that speak about social policy. I'm not so great at diagrams, but what I'm saying, my paper follows can become kind of weird as well. When he talks about the need to integrate or the need to couple or link social and economic policy. And so what I'm trying to say in this slide is that social policy can provide a crucial link between economic development, poverty reduction, and equity. If both social policy and economic policy are linked and pursued and they can be pursued in mutually reinforcing ways. And if social policy and economic policy are pursued in tandem, then social policy can be a productive force that contributes to human capital, can increase labor productivity, and promote economic growth. And that investment in social policy can drive structural transformation and sustain economic growth. But we know that always, as sometimes happens, is that social policy is treated as the younger sister or the younger sister or the lesser of the policy, and economic policy takes dominance when it comes to thinking and so on. And so I look at three key continental frameworks that we've had on the continent and look at how economic and social policy if linked within this policy regarding a policy for much time that we have right. So the first is the latest plan of action for economic development for Africa. That's the company with IDAN, and then the African Union Social Policy Framework of 2008, and then Agenda 2062, the Africa of the world. So when you look through the three frameworks that I mentioned, you find that the integration of social and economic policies, or the interlinking between social and economic policies, it happens in some of the document, and then some it has not. I think the implementation has been slow and truncated, and this is largely due to the different the different forces that are acting at play at different times when the frameworks are being developed. So in some, like
yes.
Some of the policy frameworks and design elements of socialism, especially when you think about the legal standard of action, which came after national space, after the national space. But then there is also the liberal orthodoxy, which some of the policy frameworks the African Union. But then there is also the elements of Pan-Africanism and unity that that then can be seen within the policy. And so, because of this mixed ideologies, depending on the political and economic context on the continent, then you see an oscillation between some of these ideologies in the policy. And also, there has been, I would say, there has been implementation of social policy, especially in terms of social participation. When we have a debt crisis like now, find that social policy does not get a lot of attention, and also it's related to the national privatization. But as I say, social policy is a crucial link and can provide a crucial link between economic development, political inflation, and equity.
Okay.
And
This PDF.
that when the seen to act as different, two sides of the same coin, then they can't have mutually reinforcing, they can't mutually reinforcing. And that the positive relations between, and that the several authors who see the positive relation between macroeconomic and social policy. But why is this attention to social policy comes to the continental framework? First is that economic thinking is elevated, it is thought to be higher than social political thinking, for instance. And then also social welfare is considered the end of something that comes at the end of development. This what happens after development has been achieved, therefore it tends to be residual and only pursued after people feel that you have met a certain level of economic development, which then explains why people think that social policy is a poor instrument and inferior and subordinate to economic thinking. But also there's the influence of the neoliberal orthodoxy, which sees investment in social policy as obstructive to economic development. And what this has resulted to in the continent is that it has undermined human development to a great extent, and also compromised, on the other hand, compromised economic development. But social policy, as sometimes is seen as to be about just welfare, it's not about just smoking this welfare of economic malfunction and institutions, but social policy is important to economic policy. It leads to equity and poverty reduction and mitigation. And also, when you look at the late industrializers, you see that their prioritization in social development and social policy is what led to economic development, and that was important in the process of development. Several ideas have been the ruling ideas that have framed the way social policy is about at a continental level, the African Union, or even implementation at national level. So at the post-colonial period, let's say after independence, when many countries had independence, then social policy was seen to serve, was pursued to serve the production and social cohesion function. And so national governments at that time invested heavily in education, those huge investments in education, health, and so on, and sanitation. And this was for resource production first, to be able to build a capacity of Africans that would then take over from the labor force that had related to independence. But also it was about building human capital, building the capacity of its own people, for its own people to improve the well-being. But also social policy played a role in social cohesion. And I think Tanzania is a classic, I think as Jimmy and Shina say, the most successful way which social policy was pursued in terms of nation building and in social cohesion. And so you have a Tanzania that emerges after independence that's very cohesive in terms of despite its ethnic, religious, and other differences, as a very cohesive society with solidarity and collectivism in terms of thought and so on. And so you have an increased public spending at this time after independence. Also, but then this is curtailed by what we honestly was structural adjustment programs, and government are forced to cut down on spending, especially social spending. And this offers way to the classical economic thinking, which privileges markets in allocation of resources and social policy then is relegated to a residual role.
So when you look at the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980, it was developed after the nationalist peace, after 1990, between 1960 and 1980 is what we described as the nationalist peace. So it comes to the point where we have the balance between structural adjustment programs, the debt crisis, the fast crisis, us to speak about without it. But the thrust of the Lagos Plan of Action was an emphasis on economic relance at time, thinking about industrialization for Africa. I think the same thing that we still think about now, regional integration. But then the plan of action relegated social policy while giving primacy to economic policy. Yes, agricultural development is seen as important, but there was little reference to development of the key systems. And it was based on a trickle-down economic thinking that industrialization and integration would eventually lead to a better well-being, improved well-being amongst Africans, and it failed to provide a strong lead for social and economic policy. But what is fundamentally the document in one fashion for this is that it shows a need for accelerated growth and sovereignty in terms of Pan-Africanism, like thinking about sovereignty was really an underlying philosophy in the document. After that, then the second document I look at is the AU Social Policy Framework, which was I think was which then was developed in 2002 is when it was adopted. And the AU Social Policy Framework is not talked a lot is not talked about a lot. And then I think it might be even one of the most fundamental documents in terms of advancing social policy now. It was very clear that social development is not about economic growth. And it moved within the AU social SPF, but you could see the thrust on social development, the real need for social development. This came after the adjustment phase when African countries are coming out of structural adjustment programs one. And so there was a justification that social development has to be a goal for the African continent on right. It acknowledged just the science of economic social development, but not explicitly, but not enough to be able to address the social economic challenges. Priority was of social spending, as you see that necessary. But this also, the SPF, the thing that happened with the SPF was developed at the time when there was the push for adoption of cash transfers across the continent. And so cash transfers and the idea of cash transfers was the most dominant form of social provision took over the SPF, and implementation was started. And lastly, the Agenda 2063 that it's also quite strong on aspects of social policy, acknowledging that rapid economic growth has failed to translate into poverty in the actual economy, and there is not sufficient human well-being and human well-being. It highlights the centrality of such policy, and the rest of the document is on the balance of inclusive growth, thinking about infrastructure, development, governance, and also human development. And also the intention of pursuing for integrated social policy, recognizing the link between economic growth and social policy. And offers a strong inclusivity because that means economic transformation and requiring investment in human capital, welfare, and social provision. The Agenda 2063 is when you speak, it's oriented, it's future oriented, and also the link that it has between integration, economic, and the political transformation for the continent. But some have said that it is quite ambitious, and also the governance structures or the implementation structures and also the evaluation structures are not there to see one extent social. So the challenges of the AU, want to talk about the challenges that have come, the challenges that have come with the different frameworks that we've had in the AU is that there has been the dominance of neoliberal but then has been really social and economic policy. Structural adjustment programs then derailed a lot of thinking on pursuit of social policy at continental level. And also the internal challenges of the elites now, which may be about staff capacity, but also the reliance of NGOs and international NGOs, lack of reporting structures, and also the issues of sustainability. Just to finish, maybe a point that I would like to leave with, that's from my Malibu view, was Malibu was the from Canary to United States. You cannot pursue a policy, a social policy that is grounded in solidarity. Yes, we want to pursue social policy that's grounded in solidarity. But then when you have an economic policy that promotes individualism, it cannot, but the still cannot reinforce each other in the same interest.
Thanks very much. Obviously, quite hard on time, so we're gonna have to push it. Thanks.
The microphone okay. Check that first. I'll translate you. So, free movement of people is one dimension of the African Regional Integration Index. And I'm going to discuss its entanglements with the international migration regime. The regional focus is on West African
Of speakers, I'm just
in the context of militarism and the breakdown of regional integration as outlined by
Unless I
Madam
get
Aminata Traore,
question over
the
there.
person
Oh,
around
okay,
the book.
Yeah, because that's where I
And
down.
the book
Okay, but there will be no translation. Okay.
has been a major influence on migration.
Is it
research
Greek
in
or there won't be
20
something like
years.
No, break, you see, just.
Okay, let me see.
Conceptual
I
division
have to fetch them here.
that was created in the organizations, West
Okay.
Africa and other parts of
The
Africa.
next set of speakers, let's get.
It's been outlined in several of Samaya Amin's works, among others, and these divisions have been violently amplified in the 21st century. From the expansion of the war on terror, the US war on terror to the US, French, and UK invasion of Libya, and its devastating impact in Mali, the destabilization of the Sahel region, and the reinforcement of borders in the US and Europe. With the understanding that imperialism is not only about the wealth of powers, but also its social relations, incorporating ideological domination, this arc of destruction is being driven by the West. So I'm going to set out the scope and arguments of the working paper, and then I'll elaborate on some of these points over the next 10 minutes. First, institutional approaches to freedom of movement, the free movement element of regional integration are dominated by the EU, European states, the US, the International Organization for Migration, and other institutions in IOM service to external states and to global capital.
Yeah.
These states and institutions, secondly,
It's common to regional value,
contradictions.
regional
And these contradictions would be incomprehensible were it not for the
Original.
double
Yes.
standards also found in development policies, which are led by
Regional
international
integration.
financial institutions.
So it's.
Yes.
De-integration. is
Well,
the
no, wait,
principal
wait,
arm
wait,
of
wait.
economic
No.
dependency.
regional integration as
So
a
third,
Migration and border policies present a contemporary form of structural adjustment by which the internalization of European borders is a condition of aid to indebted countries. Its paradigm of population fanaticism is concealed within neoclassical economics and other superficial metrics. So fourth, in outlining this paradigm, an alternative conceptions of the state are centered in these incompatible integration programs. From the Eurocentric perspective centered on state competitiveness and their drive for capital accumulation, and other ways that the state is objectified to the Pan-African conception, which is based on flexible network sovereignty and collective security. So this is really roots of the contradictory integration projects.
Okay.
And then finally, the practical
from
implications of
the
analysis suggest that
I was
the
thinking,
active
have a slide over
favor of
this manner, have a slide
the
over.
related perspective
But I'm not sure I have this.
American.
Oh, okay.
On migration,
But the last, I can remember the names.
You can just ask it.
Member states with the International Organization for Migration, the International Labour Organization, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and other UN agencies, the US, European State Departments. As a political counterpart to the World Bank and the IMF, the International Organization for Migration was originally founded for Western European countries in 1952 as part of the US Marshall Plan of Aid, joining with the precursor to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So that is part of its institutional history. There's a long-running critique of IOM in the way it operates for its member states, especially the US, as most of its director generals have been US politicians. And this is all despite its tagline of making migration work for all. The IOM's role historically in developing border controls, detention camps, deportation under the guise of assisted voluntary return, and other deterrents has produced a global system of containment. And this system of containment is working against those dispossessed people, and this is all hidden in its rhetoric of support for free movement and integration. IOM established a governance framework for the African Union's migration policy framework for Africa. It contributed to ECOWAS's conceptual paradigm of migration, and it has a special liaison office to the African Union Commission, to the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa, and it also has regional and state offices around the continent. IOM policy outwardly supports Pan-African free movement of people, to quote, and it participates in the African Union's Pan-African Forum on Migration in the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also in the Joint Labour Migration Programme with the African Union Commission, the International Labour Organization, Switzerland. The policy documents of the African Union and ECOWAS do account somewhat for the consequences of the EU externalizing its borders. Unlike the complete denial that you would find in IOM policy and that of Western State Departments, that the paradigm remains of migration control. So I'm going to go now into the realities of the migration regime and how it creates division and polarization within and between both continents, Africa and Europe. So we could go back 30 years to the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which restructured migration politics between states and IOM for its member countries of Algeria, France, Italy, Libya, Malta, Mauritania, Morocco, Portugal, Spain, and Tunisia. And this agreement, as Samir Amin wrote in 2004 with Ali Al-Hens, facilitated Atlantis' domination over the Sahel and Saharan regions. So this neo-colonial reinforcement of the external but also internal borders in Africa has also enabled selective labour mobility by the EU and European states that amplifies the even dynamics of capital-driven migration regimes in Africa and Europe. Xenophobia, social tensions and expulsions have expanded with material support from European powers, blocking regional circulation. Some examples of this include the EU Trust Fund for Africa, IOM border management arrangements in Mauritania, which carries the rhetoric of social cohesion and even attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's actually intensified historical social divisions, including harassment, detention and threats against so-called irregular migrants from the south, and also against Afro-Mauritanians inheriting communities. The EU-funded criminalisation of migrant transport in Niger in 2015 broke ECOWAS agreements. This was repealed after the coup. In Senegal, EU-funded border units were used in state violence that killed dozens of people towards the end of Macky Sall's regime. So the metrics of free movement, focusing on protocols and agreements, superseded by not only state prerogatives, which is already well known, but also by these extra legal migration control agreements. So, you know, we live in a time of impunity, and the EU and Italy's sponsorship of militia in Libya is now being challenged in the International Criminal Court. So none of this is captured in those metrics. So these policies have also actually forced thousands onto Europe by breaking regional circulation, including in Tunisia, where thousands of people are migrant and elsewhere were no longer able to work in Tunisia and were expelled or forced onwards towards Europe. So I'm going to talk about the dual foundations of the migration regime. So first of all, it has its basis in neoclassical economics, which itself excludes the kind of social relations that have been discussed. And underneath that is the kind of barbarism of population, Malthusian population fanaticism. So this is a false theory which connects the supply of food supply with demographics. So in response to people losing access to the necessaries of life, racialized population control is deployed rather than the more human response of agrarian regulation and other measures to address the displacement. And that's at the heart of the brutality of the regime. Migration control is responding to a so-called crisis for Europe that's based in this kind of pseudoscience. Yes. Okay. Okay. So I can't illustrate that. So I just want to say briefly that so I just want to say briefly that you know, in 2024, when almost 47,000 people arrived in the Canary Islands of West Africa's coasts, the social movements there were actually protesting against over-tourism. So this is, you know, really the understanding of political ecology, that the overpopulation applies to the people who are consuming the most resources. So I'm going to back up now and say about the underlying logic of the international migration regime and the incompatibility of integration projects between institutional projects that have countered autonomous collective development strategies and pan-Africanism founded in anti-colonial projects. So this paper has suggested a further analysis of non-capitalist or anti-capitalist migration and labour regimes to depolarize societies. And From here, I would like to open up a discussion on labour-oriented ability to support substantive equality between workers and societies, and how to sequence this with other dimensions of regional integration. And I would welcome your thoughts on taking this forward. Thank you.
We run out of time, but as a matter of courtesy, maybe just allow 3 questions that should be very short, clear, and to the point. Yes, Howard?
Thanks so much for 3 interesting presentations. Eric, the issue of monetary sovereignty in African countries is highly constrained because of the nature of climate change. And so perhaps we could talk a bit about the relationship between the generation of money supply purchasing and its implication being very high political coefficients, production of most goods and services in African countries. What way does that feed into the thinking of the actual and as a constraint? And CFA, of course, you're actually constrained by monetary expansion, by how the goals actually be designed. So it becomes very important and thinking like MND or something like that, applying it, understand what the field structure constraints. Second issue, I want to talk to kind of a bit about the issue of another kind of theoretical framework, which is the idea of reserve army. How does migration fit into the dynamics of accumulation over time of reproduction? And in what way it is kind of as supposed to be a classical approach, kind of feel like economics underlying the thinking, how these are the global categories in play, both in terms of the flows coming back, as well as flow individual, the ways that we pressure on wages down, by utilizing migrants as a reserve army, and that underlying dynamic. And then the third issue on social policy is, I think, something that is perhaps a bit understated, and that is the relationship between how social policy is designed feeding into the relations. What you see in regimes like Uganda is you see a situation of increasing wealth concentration because you've entirely privatized social goods as an economic products and people, whatever assets they have, any crisis or get was easy. Do something like a line, and that feeds into a different vision of accumulation dynamics, with the notion among mainstream economists that they each go through more productive uses and actually utilizing it for their own purposes. So talking about that dynamic and really important dynamic, but to get that in fact sub-Saharan Africa has second size low concentration. And this is how and understanding how that economic system, social policy, which I think is an important factor.
Lady Bradford.
I have a question for the first panelist about monetary policy as well. And I'm curious, I'd like to put to you, what would it take for African countries, given where we are, to adopt such a monetary policy, which would lead to the kind of sovereignty that we talked about, and would enable the kinds of development policy that you also referred to? And can you think of examples where African countries have attempted this either historically or in current day? And what are the constraints that they face if there are?
And the last one, ladies and gentlemen, the gentleman in front here.
So my question also goes to Eric concerning the market. He did mention that the government is like a household where they need to balance the balance. Right? You look at this, a difference. The government has an infinite ability to create money. The household has a governance. So what is the disagreement in the difference? And also concerning taxation. And the way you explain, I said, well, you need, when the government spends, it needs taxation to balance. But you know, well, governments do not need taxes to balance their budget. They spend as much as they can borrow and print money. The budget only, then taxes only come at the end, whether they report it or not. So it doesn't make the deficits a problem, depending on where you are looking. So basically, if you look at the taxes and spending, whether those two angles really balance. Thank you.
Your question is very short. Just in front here, the last. Oh.
Allô. Merci beaucoup. Moi, je m'en participe à vous. J'aimerais juste partager ma contribution et poser une question à Anna pour Fabien pour les prochains. J'aimerais d'abord remercier les organisateurs de cette conférence. Moi, la question de la migration m'intéresse beaucoup parce qu'en fait, la migration est par nature un phénomène naturel. Et nous sommes tous des migrants. Le problème en est que le droit des migrants est tout le temps violé, surtout pour les pays sous-développés. Et nous assistons à tous les jours la violation de leurs droits. Et par contre, aujourd'hui, les migrants, dans la politique migratoire au Sénégal, on parlait de migration clandestine. Et la société civile a pu lutter pour qu'on enlève le mot clandestine parce que les migrants sont souvent victimes d'un système. Donc, il fallait travailler pour qu'on accepte le concept de la migration irrégulière. Donc, si la question de la migration irrégulière, on a vu souvent, nous, par exemple, au Sénégal, pour voyager dans une région, ceux qui sont à Bienchar peuvent en témoigner. Ils sont obligés de prendre vos empreintes en traversant un pays. Et ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, là, la sécurité frontière souvent oblige cela. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous sommes dans un monde où l'insécurité est devenue l'insécurité est devenue une menace. Ma question est de savoir comment concilier le respect du droit des migrants et la sécurité de nos frontières. Voilà la question que j'aimerais juste poser. C'est quel degré de vous aviez pour consolider le respect du droit des migrants et la sécurisation de nos frontières?
Thanks very much. To make your point. Thank you. That's a sharp one, please. Thank you. And panelists, please be sharp in responding. Not a shout from my colleagues, but completely run out of time.
Moi, c'est juste une question. À la dernière intervention de la question de traitement, on constate ces dernières années que l'immigration est une réelle variable d'ajustement dans différents contextes. Et ce qui m'intéresse, c'est le contexte africain. Si vous avez parlé de l'attitude de cet État d'Afrique du Nord, dans ces différents pays, l'Algérie, la Tunisie, la Libye, mais aussi le Maroc, le migrant est par excellence une variable d'ajustement politique. Avec le développement des populismes et du souverainisme, on met le migrant comme, on définit le migrant comme la cause de tous les problèmes, avec bien sûr comme conséquence une violence extraordinaire contre les migrants dans ces pays. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Thanks very much. I think that's the end of the question. And picture. Thanks.
I guess I'll put that in reverse order. I think we say the House of the government say they're different. And one thing that is quite different is that if you look at the data, fiscal deficits are a stylized fact of public finance. They are not abnormal situations. They occur all the time over decades. And so the first question you have to ask yourself is, how is it possible for government to run deficits and usually get by without having financial crisis? Okay, and we have growing public. The answer is monetary sovereignty, which brings us to what is monetary sovereignty about? Is it about changing the way you source your spending? No. We're not saying that once you have monetary sovereignty, suddenly you're going to print a lot of money. What monetary sovereignty is saying is that it is normal, that's the usual way we spend. You spend by creating your own money. And in practice, the way this is done, this is not an exceptional thing. And this occurs all the time. In practice, the way it occurs is through the coordination of the central bank and the treasury. Okay. Again, we usually think of the central bank and the treasury are independent entities, and the central bank can set its interest rates for sure. So it has policy independence, but it doesn't have financial independence from the treasury. Every option, every month, the central bank participates in options. The way that happens varies by countries. But if you take Canada, the central bank can directly participate by about 20%. She can have up to 20% of the balance sheet in treasury. So that's not reached the limit. You can just buy new treasuries. In the United States, you can only refinance. So if you have treasuries that are maturing, you can just buy new ones to replace the old ones. But what we do in the United States too is you finance the major institutions that are responsible for buying most of the treasuries. So you put financial institutions in the middle with a pretend that gives you market pricing, but the central bank is behind them and financing them all the time. So the indirect financing of the treasury by the central bank. And that works throughout all. So this pretends that the central bank and the treasury are completely independent, and the central bank does not finance the treasury, that it's a normal thing that never happens, that you should just taxing the borrowing, and borrowing is done in the market without central bank interference. It's not true. That is all the time. All the time. And so with that in mind, and then the word is not about just printing. Okay, what we're saying is that your constraints are different. Your constraints are non-financial. So that brings me to the last question, which is about import content. And so what I tried to do, I apparently failed to do in the presentation, is to try to show you how you try to deal with issues of import constraint and external resources. Your monetary sovereignty cannot help you with obtaining external resources unless you are in the United States or a few other countries where you have a foreign demand for your currency. But for most of us, unfortunately, or most of you, I'm from the United States, I'm double guilty, I'm French and I'm very so, for most of you outside these countries, indeed, you have this problem. And so what I tried to show you is how to do that. But the point is that this thinking then comes in terms of constraining yourself, also in terms of the use of domestic resources. Okay. And there's plenty you can do with your domestic resources with your monetary sovereignty, as long as you're willing to do it and to put in place policy that allow you to use your domestic resources.
I think we should have mentioned with time, but yes, there is dealing between social policy and production policy, and also other factors. The social policy is about welfare, but that also the protection against poverty can be used for productivity, redistribution of national food and also social capital, be able to handle the issues of gender regulation, and gender regulation. But I think what's happening in terms of productivity, as we've had populist programs that have been pursued, for instance, in a lot of reporting. For instance, information cash transfer, and then also microfinance.
make the final that I think, Kenya is an example, and I think our country will have programs like the Hustler Fund, which basically is supposed to, is seen or it's sold as a program, but then is going to enhance the productivity of individuals or communities, especially in context where you have high informal labor. But then what it does is it actually doesn't, first of all, it doesn't pursue the purpose that it doesn't fulfill the purpose that it was set to do. But it doesn't take into context the economic, it also doesn't take into context the economic and also the political, this political settlement. But then in other areas, you see social policy, for instance, focus on community benefits that are much related to what it is used for instance, construction of infrastructure in other countries. And I think countries on the continent are trying to do that, and they see that governments are now borrowing from pension schemes, pension funds to finance growth, infrastructure, and so on. And so I think the link that can be pursued, I think at a better scale, better, at a better scale than just the individual or individual micro loan and so on. But also I think there is the basic thinking about it in the wider national productivity beyond one.
Thank you. I'm going to respond to the second question first. First and the third are related. So on the question of violating migrants' rights and measuring that against border security, I mean, I'm not going to be too dogmatic about just end all borders, but I will say that this is something that's posed in policy frameworks, implementing social sciences. So how do you balance security of borders with the rights of migrants? And when we look at the real experiences in West Africa, then you have to ask security, was it necessary to have 9 new border posts between Senegal and Mauritania? Who did they benefit, and how are they traded up against the security of the United States? So, when it comes with EU funding, then it's not really for the sovereignty of African countries. So, how to manage that. It's also a question of political economy, and of the importance of historicising the borders and managing them in the current conjuncture with regional integration plans and so on. So how that's done is really the prerogative of states, through the kind of state concepts that's been discussed. So on the question of the reserve army and the pressure on wages, I mean, I couldn't really touch on this, but I suppose the underlying drivers of migration and relocation is that European and US economies rely on having a reserve of labour to work in the most essential areas, like care, medical services, food production, and so on. So they don't only use migration to put pressure on wages, and one of the biggest challenges for the left in those societies is to encourage an internationalism that prevents these kind of contradictions, between different groups of workers. And it's actually in everyone's interest to end the imperialism that drives this kind of migration, because then wages are going to be better everywhere. But I don't want to say, even as a Marxist, that the reserve army is the only logic for migration regime, because I think it is also about social relations, which brings us to the third question about populism and the political aspects. And here it's important to recognise the political economy of this populism, that there is really quite a strong correlation with populism and the state project, whether that's tax accumulation. And as austerity goes up, then populism and anti-migrant rhetoric goes up. And we see this in European states, we also see it in other states, and, you know, we can even look at the difference between the, previous regimes in development and the current one, and how the end sales regime, ended up increasing social division. So, you know, the states neoliberalize, then the consequence of that is populism, and that's why it's important to get to the material basis of this, you know, rather than kind of condemning all these, you know, kind of nationalist perspectives. So we get onto the causes of this and we try and challenge it, and ultimately to encourage labour internationalism, the benefits of Muslim so.
Send it to her.
Thanks very much, colleagues. Please a round of applause for the speaker.
Well, thank you very much for this very insightful panel. So without any transition, we move to the next panel about regional integration and the pathway to industrial transformation. So our chair, the chair of the discussion is going to be Dr. Yaya. So who is a research fellow at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. She has a PhD and a Master's of Science in Economics from the University of London and a Master's of Arts in Economics from the University of Cambridge. So she has over 15 years of teaching experience with a particular focus on research, philosophy, methods, finance and development, as well as entrepreneurship and development as well. So among many of her responsibilities, she's on the editorial board of the International Journal of Technological Learning, Innovation, and Development. So she spent 4 years as a director of the Kenyan Bank and is currently a member of governance body of the financial sector, Living Trust Kenya. So please help us welcome Dr. Radha.
Voice was Ben Van. Yeah, Ben Van. Ben Van. Ben Van. It's surely. That drive, not.
Hey everyone, this next section is on regional integration and pathways to industrial transformation. I think one of the factors across all
So
is inability to have structural transformation.
give me that.
Industry or manufacturing as a proportion of GDP. As a Kenyan, I can say the last years, our manufacturing of GDP has gone down. So it's still really challenging area that, and I think it's not just because mediums in perspective on that. I won't actually go into the bios of each of this because they're all very accomplished, like everyone who speaks today, and I guess you will be able to time to do that. So we have Owen Tonge, who's from the University of Cape Town, who's going to talk about regional value chains and regional integration in Africa, or bottom of the page. So,
7 minutes. Even further. Okay.
I don't have the slides, can we have the slides? Thank you very much, and thank you, Jongo and the team for the invitation to be here. I've been moving very quickly through the slides. I wanted to speak about something that has not been touched on quite well in the presentations we've had. And this is the idea of regional value chains. And I want to situate the concept of regional value chains in the context of delinking. I know that Samira Bean's theory of delinking did not touch on regional value chains, but they do, I want to make the argument that they do give us the tools through which we can actually partially delink and eventually even attempt to delinking. So my presentation, I want to speak about three things. I want to speak about regional integration in Africa. Why is it necessary? And the second thing I want to speak about is what is the role of regional value chains, and how does that help us to promote integration, but also unity, so that we can harness the continent's potential. And then the third part of this, I want to speak about the strategy. What are the strategies that we have to promote regional value chains? And how can those strategies contribute to promoting unity? Because the purpose, and I want to make this upfront, the purpose of regional value chain is, the purpose of regional integration is not that it's an end in itself. The end of regional value chain, regional integration is African unity. And if we delink those two, then we are missing the point. We can talk about regional integration, but what we want effectively is to achieve that African unity. So regional integration for the continent, and I always make this comment that the unity of the continent has been always a response to the realities that the people of Africa face at any historical point. And this comes from the idea that unity gives us hope. And when the continent is united, there is hope. And the reverse of this, the fragmentation of the continent, is also weakness. And so the logic is very clear that historically we've always wanted to unite as a response to the realities that we face. And so fragmentation does not serve the interest of Africa at all. It serves the interest of the colonial system. And so regional integration then becomes a very important aspect of creating that mechanism for us to realize the African potential. So in a sense, regional integration can be seen as the strategic vehicle through which we can achieve three major things. One is that we can achieve the ability to harness the potential of the continent. And the potential there in broad terms, not just economic, but other forms of potential. We can also use regional integration to overcome the fragmentation, but also to achieve development. Now, this just a quick word on the conception of regional integration. There are different models that people use to speak about regional integration, but the one on the board is the most popular one. And the African Union at the moment are following what we call the linear model. The linear model is this idea that you start with the lower levels of integration, which will be your preferential trade area. And that means you give preferential access of goods to countries. And you move through the stages until you get to political union. Yeah. And this is what the African Union is following at the moment. And the big question there is that it is an economic project that is riding regional integration. So the political question is actually sidelined. And I'd like to quote Nkrumah here, who argued that actually African unity is first and foremost a political project, and not the other way around. So if you achieve the political project, then you can achieve economic integration. But not that at the moment. We are doing it the other way around. We want to economically integrate, and then through that we achieve political union, which we can debate later. So this is just a roadmap of the Abuja Treaty, the African Economic Community. And if you follow this, most of you might have seen this, that by 2027 we should have actually achieved a single currency and monetary union. We are nowhere near that. But these are the stakes for the Abuja Treaty. Regional integration in Africa, of course, Jomo Sono, who is not here today, always says that there is much more passion for unity on the continent than anywhere else. And I agree with it. But we haven't exploited that passion. And perhaps we should do more. I've just had a few ideas that form part of that express or manifest that passion. From the establishment of the OAU right through to the FCFTA, those are all examples of Africa wanting to unite and seeing some value in unity, but achieving very little. Pillars of regional integration. So as it is being practiced now by the African Union, we have four types of integration. There's political integration, which at the moment focuses on integrating institutional and legal frameworks of different countries. There's economic integration that focuses particularly market integration, which is trade. The FCFTA was one example. There's infrastructure integration that focuses on integrating different infrastructure, particularly road network, energy, and so on. And we have what we call the energy power pools all across the region. And then the important part, which is never addressed, but very critical, is the human and social integration. Free movement of people, we just heard about that. The status of regional integration at the moment, and not there on the statement I want to make is it's fragmented. Still fragmented from in the same way that the colonial governments left it on the continent. So despite the strong passion, despite the strong many initiatives, we still have a very fragmented continent. And I won't go into the details of that. But the implication of that is that, and we'll see just now, that because of that fragmentation, one of the implementations, there's so many of them, including law, inter-Africa trade, but also importantly for industrialization is weak and fragmented production system. Yeah. And Martin Fisher in the morning was making a very important point that trade alone will not transform the continent. You have to address the production or productive capabilities. And as long as you're not producing, we can trade, and trade can grow up to 80% in the region, but we might be selling Chinese or Indonesian goods, and that doesn't do good to us. So productive system integration is very, very important. But also, when we achieve that unity, we reduce the vulnerability, exposure to external shocks. This, I want to run through this quite quickly. What you have there is the intra-regional trade, and here we take the continent as a whole, and then compare to other major regional regions in the world, including North America, Latin America, East Asia, South Asia. What you see there is that from 1995, the African intra-regional was the lowest. At the moment, as we speak, 2024, 2025, it's slightly above Latin America, but still one of the lowest. And this is just intra-African import trade. And I don't want to spend much time there. What we do here is just to split to see what's the different regions look like. And of course, the lowest region will be Central Africa and North Africa. North Africa has very little regional trade. And then the exports, so we break export and import. And we see also there, what is worrying here is also that in terms of intra-Africa export, it rose actually, it went up to 2015 up to about 19%. But actually it has been dropping and currently it's just about 15%. How do we, and now one of the reasons for that, there are two key reasons. One of them is that the drop of the commodity prices reduce the ability to import and therefore let's say the export capacity going, the import capacity from other countries. The second one is also the debt burden, that it has actually taken away some of the capacity to import. Then we look at what does Africa export to itself. And this is very interesting. The little on the top right corner there tells us that Africa actually at the moment is exporting to itself more manufactured foods than anything else. So if we add the food, particularly processed food, we have about 65% of intra-Africa export is actually manufactured. Of course, there's 21% petroleum and so on, and 1% services. And that tells you, and the reason for that is that the African manufacturers face very stiff competition into the global market. The African market, especially now with the trade agreement, that it fares there February. And just as some of the big exporters there, of course, led by South Africa, 28% of the intra-Africa trade, Egypt, Nigeria, and so on. And then this is just showing intra-Africa trade by region, but for the continent as a whole, we have about $110 billion in terms of trade, which is actually very small. The important story is also the rise of East African community, or East Africa in particular, that their share in Africa's total trade is growing. The SADC region actually varies, and West Africa also has grown over the last 20 years. Just a little bit of a note there on why is progress so slow to integrating the continent. And despite the many, we have several of those initiatives, but yet we still remain fragmented. And there's different groups. One of them is, of course, that regional integration takes time. That if you look at the experience of Europe, that they didn't just achieve that. They didn't just achieve that in 3 years or so. And so we should be patient with that. There's another view that speaks about the implementation gap that as a reason, or what some people refer to as the implementation cost. Others also point to the fact that perhaps the continent we're using a wrong model of integration, that we should actually find, especially the linear model based on the functionalist theory, that it is not suitable for the continent that we find is more. Others also would argue that actually integration has been slow because we've been focusing mainly on market integration and ignored adaptive system, and so on. I want to, and I know I have 3 minutes, and I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'll try and do it quickly. So the idea of the value chain. So what is the value chain? The value chain is a research, as a concept of tracking value from a conception of a product to its consumption, what we call the C2C chain. And it's different from a commodity chain, because in a commodity chain, we are looking at the flow of commodity, but in the value chain, we're actually tracking value. And the value chain idea comes from this idea that production of any product or service before it's delivered on the market goes through different phases. And at every phase, there's value that's being added. And in this case, we can see the conception of raw materials and there's processing of raw material, distribution, consumption, including now recycling and disposal. And at every value, we are now beginning to see that we can now track what value has been added, what percentage of the total. So for instance, we take this laptop and say, let's trace the laptop. through its production. And at what percentage of value has been added at every stage. And that allows us to see, and when we look at that, you realize that the continent actually has been getting very little from all the value chain. And I've always been saying that most of the value chain starts on the continent, and yet we get very little of that. And this is where we come up with the idea of a regional value chain. The regional value chain is then to domesticate the addition, but also the capture of value at different phases. And I won't go into details. I've got a little bit of an illustration there showing value moving between different countries and so on. And just to speak a little bit about this, the cotton value chain, because it's more specific. And for any country that has industrialized, this is the beginning. Before you get it in food processing, you have to learn how to process cotton into fabric. And the cotton value chain gives us an example of how the continent can create a regional value chain. Because the production of cotton, Mali, Burkina Faso, Tanzania, in that order, are the three largest producers of cotton. But because the cotton that is produced on the continent is exported in the form of leaf. You just remove the seeds and the rest of the fags are shipped to China. And then Eswatini and Lesotho, Madagascar, and to a certain extent Mauritius and Kenya that manufacture shirts and garments. They have to import fabric back from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, and China for processing. Why do we have to do that? And when we do that, we actually lose more value because for the Chinese and the Bangladeshi to process the lint into yarn and fabric and dye it and bring it back, they capture a large part of that value. And the idea of the regional value chain is that we reorient this. Cotton produced in Mali feeds into the factory in Lesotho and Swaziland or any other place. And then from there we are then domesticating or regionalizing or localizing that value. And that can lead to particularly stronger regional integration. I won't go into the strategies, but just to say that the three ranks, East African Community, the Southern African Community, Development Community, and ECOWAS have all recognized different value chains that can be what they are calling the strategic regional value chains. I won't go into the details. And then just a little bit about integration from below. So just 1 minute, yes. So the idea of integration from below is that integration has been pursued at the African Union. The politicians meet in Addis Ababa and then discuss and then nothing happens. But actually on the ground, we are seeing initiatives with business, but also just ordinary people trying to mix more and articulate the idea of African unity. And that's what we are referring to as integration from below. Thank you very much. I've run out of time. Let me end.
Yes, I really appreciated the call for the aim for regional integration is to promote students and the thinking change that is needed. So our next speaker is Albert Stein, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, and he's going to speak on industrial policy, critical mineral development, and African-based manufacturing, institutional dimensions. Okay. Sorry, that was the title of
Okay, I'm done. Yeah, unfortunately, it's long. Just désolé. All right, so basically, the title that actually I mentioned was one I was going to give in South Africa. It wasn't able to show up, so
This is actually the focal point I want to look at is kind of looking at the theoretical base of regional economic arrangements, also regional trade arrangements, and where it comes from. Because it becomes very important understanding the significance of economic theory, the generation of policy, and how you conceptualize these arrangements. So what I'd like to do is just kind of show you how rapidly the expansion has gone of regional trade agreements. Both globally and within that program. So you look through probably 2025. I want to go through all the numbers, but it's really been an extraordinary proliferation of global regional trade arrangements. Most recently, the WTO distinguishes three broad categories of RTAs. Of course, notices RTAs, of course, and one also includes inactive RTAs. You know, and you can just see how rapidly there has been proliferation. If you look at just the new millennium, you know, initially looking at 92 RTAs signed, 51 in force between 48 and 1990, but most recently, there's been an explosion in the new millennium worldwide, 855 and 356. There's somewhat of a similar pattern in sub-Saharan Africa as well, and which again was fairly slow with only 27 signed agreements. 10 were active by 2000, numbers almost doubled and reached 40 and 17 respectively. But by 2025, we now have 85 regional trade arrangements, with roughly 48 or so in force. And the percentages over time has been fairly steady relative to the global figures. I don't want to spend too long on this. Basically, you've got the three categories: partial scope agreements, a limited list of products, free trade areas of custom unions. Often, each grouping also includes economic integration agreements, which allows for the removal of barriers in the trade of services following the GATS agreement in 1995. Basically, 90% or so of the trade agreements in force in the database were free trade areas. Roughly 14 to 4% were custom unions. I don't want to review the reason why there has been this proliferation, but I think it becomes really important to understand how these are conceptualized. What's the economic theory that is driven at, both in the motivation, the design, and the criteria to evaluate the impact of these agreements. And one of the main arguments here, and of course, we have a few leading moments to make it, is that key reason for the poor outcomes of regional trade agreements in Africa is because it simply relied far too much on neoclassical economic theory. And I don't have a lot of time to go through a lot of the economics, but I want to kind of go back to some of the foundational articles that created this thinking to this moment. And in the paper, what I'm doing is I'm tracking that conceptualization all the way from how the kind of foundational papers conceive regional trade arrangements within the context of neoclassical economic theory, and its continuity over time, all the way through the most influential economics organization in Africa, the African Economic Research Consortium, and into the actual practice of the East African community. Now, I arrived in Tanzania as a young lecturer in 1980, and just after the collapse of the East African community, you know, and I remember when I tried to give my first lecture in Kenya in 1981. I couldn't fly. I couldn't go to Kenya. I had to go to the Seychelles to get that Nairobi. It was insane. But a lot of the original mistakes that were part of the original agreement have actually been reproduced in today's approach to the East African community. So I don't have a lot of time to develop the alternative theory. It's something I think really should come out of this conference, is the alternative constructs and how we build regional trade agreements in a manner which will be much more effective for purposes of development. So very quickly, we go back to some of the earlier, of course, the most famous article was Weiner back in the 1950s, but the really important foundational one was written by Bella Balassa in 1961, who had a huge impact in policy, because Balassa, in a lot of ways, as I wrote in the 2008 book, was one of the key architects of structural adjustment in his role in the World Bank as an advisor. And basically, his interpretation of economic integration and regional arrangement was completely neoclassical with a very strong neoliberal bent reflecting his ideological proclivity, which fed into the creation of the structural adjustment policies through the World Bank. And basically, what we see is the designing of regional economic arrangements based upon Velasquez's view, and you can see the continuity over time, by nature, ipso facto leads to very poor outcomes. Now, Velasquez is a really influential guy. This article, this book actually was cited 5,500, almost equivalent to the Customs Union issue of 1951, of the first book in this area. We got influential. And much of Velasquez's inclination, I would say to some degree, if we see it today in the regional trade agreements, was his attempt to use these agreements to, in fact, reduce the dirigism, to actually reduce the role of the state in economic activity. And in some senses, then, he very carefully says, listen, economic integration is not the equivalent of trade globalization, but it is an enlargement of the economic area which intensifies competition and leads to less interference with productive activities at the firm level. And so he saw the integration in Europe very hopefully as a mechanism to counter the role of the state in Europe, to kind of rescue it in some senses, to reduce the scope of state intervention. And so it was part of it from the beginning, an element of this neoliberal project. And what I'd argue at the end is, in fact, the very essence of successful regional integration is going to be much more state intervention, much more industrial policy, much more coordination. But it's actually led to a situation which is significantly undercut this kind of theory, the ability to intervene and deal with that kind of industrial policy. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Velasquez uses it even more problematic than the original work of Weiner. They look at welfare in the context of whether it's trade increasing or trade reducing. But Velasquez actually becomes even more narrow and focuses on the issue of trade optimality, and looks at the existence of whether the increases of parties' welfare without reducing welfare another, based upon consumption. And we see this impact on the thinking of consumption and welfare as an important dimension in this moment is the conceptualization, operation of regional trade agreements. He does go about beyond the static efficiency into looking, well, we can also perhaps increase the production possibility. But sadly, this kind of conceptualization has been unduly influenced historically in Africa, among other regional trade agreements. There's a second piece I want to spend just a couple of minutes on, and that was a piece that was not so much looking at the European community, but actually looking at regional trade agreements in developing countries. Now, Metzl is an interesting character. He was a member of the U.S. delegation in Bretton Woods negotiation, heavily pushing back Keynes's proposals for a bank, and he was a key architect in the International Monetary as it was created, of course, which became the foundational approach to kind of monetarism in the Pollock model and conceptualization. He was an advisor also to Eisenhower, and once again showed up at a key period of neoliberalism, the World Bank, in the late 60s and particularly in the early 90s. Now, he does talk about he talks about welfare losses and gains, and he basically argues that the analysis is a bit too narrow because you're looking at existing patterns of trade, kind of assuming the comparative advantage factor down that. He suggests basically the effects of regional arrangements don't have this, is really focusing on increasing competition, a bit like the thinking of Velasquez. And also, well, the potential for economies of scale, right? Maybe developmental role, opportunities to increase domestic and foreign investment, innovation, expanding the export base, improving the balance of payments, mobilizing unemployment resources, avoiding economic dualism. Sounds good, right? Well, these are important goals. Sadly, the neoclassical economic constructs in the work of Metzl he uses neither is capable of understanding the causes of the lack of development, nor the tools that are needed to fundamentally address the challenges of the framework of economic arrangements. And again, I don't have a lot of time to go through this, but it's again kind of the issue of the approach. And his view, of course, is all of this will follow. Why? Simply increase the amount of competition, operating within the zone, and that's where you get the foundational benefits very consistent with neoclassical economics. Of course, in essence, the space for competition is the best way to address it. It's an ideological assertion, not even justified in an empirical way. And in some senses then, talks about the possibility of structurally changing things, maybe saving foreign exchange, basically. But what becomes crucial here is understanding that the main mechanism of welfare increases from his perspective is it increases the variety of goods at lower average costs. Interregional trade specialization will change relative prices and consumption patterns towards optimal conditions. Well, really, in some ways, back to Pareto optimality, really talking about increasing the variety for utility maximization of consumption availability, rather than looking at the production stuff. He's very much against tariff walls. He's against monetary unions. He takes on the work of Tinbergen, who very wisely says, maybe we should have some planning here in Latin America, the common market. He rips that apart. He said the worst thing is planning. We just need to open up the markets for everything to fall. I don't have time to go through this. I want to talk about how it's got manifested. I don't have time also to track this thinking through the neoclassical literature over time, which I've done to some degree in the paper. I want to come back to the real world implications of how this foundational theoretical approach has affected the thinking in the most influential economic group on the continent, the African Economic Research Consortium, which I and others have written about. Now, in 2018, the ARC has been incredibly influential. So they used to have these senior policy seminars, and there was one held in Kampala in 2018 called Rethinking Regional Integration in Africa. How exciting! We're going to rethink it. We're going to think what's going on with it. Unfortunately, there was no rethinking. It was just a kind of a repetition. And in some sense, you've got 122 participants from dozens of African countries, senior level government officials, really saying, in some sense, we'll see, you're not doing things in a neoclassical way. No, and that's how it's going to solve it. And you can see the direct influence of the conceptualization of loss and lifestyle, perhaps through the teaching that people got in regional trade and the neoclassical courses put on by the ARC over time. But, regional integration has progressed well, they argue, with significant economic benefits. ECOWAS and SASDA have contributed significantly to regional trade. Same is true for the East African community, they argue, which realized a substantial increase in intra-EAC trade. But notice the discussion is not on the structure of trade, basically, but in fact is based on the implicit neoclassical notion that welfare is simply increased by the availability of more commodities for consumption. But still, the results are suboptimal, due, of course, to poor government policies, which are in some senses not sufficiently neoliberal enough. Rules of origin, non-tariff barriers, inefficient border practices, restrictive regulations on products that underlie and disrupt African trade. So they also recognize there are structural problems, there's economic geography, similarity of sources of comparative advantage, reasons, that is a bit of a barrier. But ultimately say that the real reason here is we're back to comparative advantages, unprocessed resource exports. We focus on the high transportation costs due to the geography, making the efficiency of transport border crossings paramount. So key really is a focus on trade costs, which means improving infrastructure and related services. I don't go through it. I don't really have the time to go through it. But I've got 3 minutes and this is probably generous. So, but I want to go and I track through how the thinking entirely is embedded in the kind of my myxo philosophy of the world, and in line with, just to make this one point, in line with Glass's focus on removing the state, what do they argue? The elephant in the room when it comes to gross unsatisfactory outcomes on myriad regional initiatives in Africa, it's the political economy of execution. Realizing the ambitious inter-African trade integration agenda requires dealing with political economy factors that constrain greater focus in this area. So I want to leave my remaining 2 minutes to stop, give some examples in the East African community. So basically, to kind of cite one observer in 1979 talking about the breakup, basically it was kind of the notion that the framework was laissez-faire, it was a common market, it was just the assumption that free trade would lead all the economic benefits, and that's what's false. A lot of that is still the underlying thinking here. So, and if you look at the 25th anniversary of the EAS website, it's quite interesting. What are they focusing on? you know, what's the problem? Well, you know, World Banks, they heavily rely on the World Bank's doing business notion which is very neoliberal. That's these regulations that are in place that are really blocking everything. We've got to demobilize the state in line with the law said to make everything operate. We got to reduce the cost of business by 70%, and it's a series of very neoliberal formulations of the assumed nature of what will transpire. I want in the last minute or two talk very quickly about the attempts to actually look at the industrial side. It does actually have something called the EAC Industrial Policy 2012-2013. But the document is replete with errors influenced by neoclassic economics. It lacks an institutional framework for implementing, including creating or identifying industrial policy organizations with the capacity to operationalize industrial policy and ultimately transform conditions for industrialization, EAC. I don't again have much time to get into this, so let me basically very talk about it. I go through a lot of examples and how and why it's ineffective. Let's go to my point. Okay. Yeah. Conclusions. Conclusions. Basically, if you look at a meeting with the AAC in 2023, they were sitting and lamented, how come this hasn't worked? In fact, what we see is a decline in the percentage and share of manufacturing in the GDPs down to only a mere 8%. What's going on? Well, we just must be these same things. Let's just keep hammering it again. It's not neoliberal enough. We never liberalize more, and then we'll get the results. And what I can say is we have to kind of use an alternative set of constructs. And one of the things is operating and thinking in terms of original institutional economic theory, that regional arrangements are best seen as institutional constructs that can transcend the limitation of individual countries' ability to mobilize finance and other resources generating manufacturing capacities, providing in a large market. So I don't have very time. I go through, I just give some examples here of a paper that we finished at the conference, the NEC conference here, last year. And so what we have basically is, I wrote a paper with Mike Olabose, and we talked about it. This becomes very important to conceptualize industrialization with this opportunity to green industrialization. And so we can think maybe about how you can do this in actual formally. And so we have a series of different units that need to be actually put in place, which you can build up at the regional level, be able to support IP, in terms of financing IP, providing expertise, and kind of moving forward. Now, I want to make one last comment, basically. And let me just quote, unfortunately, and this is the last thing I'll say. So looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, unfortunately, if you look at a piece that just came out of the South Center, you say, well, what about there? Is there any hope in that? And I'll read this very quickly. It should be noted the focus of tariff and regulatory restrictions appear to be at the expense of any serious effort to coordinate and integrate even the other minimal measures related to productive capacity and infrastructure that was identified in part by the program boosting intra-African trade that was adopted as a necessary counterpart to launch it. In short, it would appear that the same one-size-fits-all measure of trade liberalization, basically originating from this original sin of conceptualization of neoclassic economics, one-size-fits-all measure trade that have been experienced in the past that are now being applied on an African setting with the hope that it will somehow yield different results. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement of this nation will not fulfill the expectations of economic transformation and integration. On the contrary, it will simply contribute to creating a bigger African market for further domination of foreign products and investors over African products and investors, and bigger producers over small ones. Thank you.
And for those of you who really want to appreciate the kind of relevance of bodies like IDAN and what we're all here for, I highly recommend two papers by both Professor Stein and Rachel on economy and society to really highlight the dominance of African Economic Research Consortium. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Giuliano Gahima from the Neve Institute of Art College, and he'll be discussing leveraging regional value chains for green job creation in Africa.
All right, yeah. Yeah, all right. Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Giovanni Gilma from the Rethinking Institute, and this is kind of my length of the title of the presentation for this afternoon. Leveraging regional value chain for regional creation in Africa, as a sector of the entire framework. Despite of the lengthiness of the title of the presentation itself, the kind of motivation of the paper is very simple. The idea is to evaluate the impact of implementing the window guarantee program in Africa using data from the OECD intercountry input output table, constructing some sectoral multipliers to identify an optimal job guarantee design. And we argue that for achieving this objective, the region will require shaping regional value chain. You may mostly to that. We are strengthening inter-African backward and global linkages and predicting the interregional integration, in particular fostering South-South cooperation, in particular the developed region with the same level of development, such as Latin America, to reduce the dependence on. So this is sort of the outline of the presentation. As for sort of the general framework, so I mean, I don't need to remind you how sort of the challenge of unemployment and precarious labor position which region present is one of the most pressing developmental issues of the country. And then maybe I just give you three events for sort of capturing this problem. So in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is sort of recent ILO data, 46% of population lived in extreme poverty in 2024. 89% of the population lived on less than $8.3 per day, and 66% of the extreme working poor are located in Africa. So this means that the structural individualization of labor persists even in periods of outward expansion, reflecting sort of even the deficiency in the productive capacity, in the infrastructure, and in the technological capabilities. So this means that sort of bold and sort of different approaches, in particular on the sort of the employment and the job creation side are needed. So for instance, one of the sort of that have imploded in recent years are this job creation program, or as mostly commonly known, the literature, the job guarantee sort of program, which was originally, dates back in the 60s, and was originally put forward by Hyman Minsky and so that a sort of a counterpart of the sort of the central bank as a sort of lender or as a sort of financial market. Because for the need of stabilizing sort of an unstable economy. The latest book was Minsky. That obviously subject to cyclical fluctuation due to the decision and expectation of private sector, seldomly driven by rationalism. So, in a national job guarantee aims to provide publicly funded employment to all individuals willing and able to work at a social inclusive wages. Physically placing the public sector as employable as resource and ensuring counter-cyclical labor consumption, and also helping to one for nominal wages and relative prices. And crucially, when targeted toward infrastructure, personal income, and the ecological restoration, such programs can also generate long-term productive gains and environmental benefits. In order to assess the idea, the feasibility of this idea, and having a measure of the macroeconomic implication of such a program, we draw on the intercountry table data for 2009 as compiled by the OECD. We then looked at a regional input-output table in which selected Africa, we put together selected Africa economies, the only one available in this data set. And where with non-selected group of countries were pulled into two additional regions, mainly Latin America, that is only Latin America that were available in this data set, and the remaining one were set in this better. Oh, that's true. Okay. Okay, so I have to. Is this okay? Is this better? Oh, slow down my speed. Okay. Sorry. mean, I was told that I had 10 minutes, so that's. Anyway, right, so we basically put together the data available for ICO into three sets of data, namely this the African region with the only 8 available economies in this data set. Then we aggregated the Latin American, when we did the same basically for Latin American economies, and then we aggregated the rest in the sort of the rest of the world, the rest of the. And then for that, we derived forward we estimated the forward and backward linkages both at the intra and the inter-regional sort of level in order to analyze the characteristic of each industry in this region and as well as the reliance upon external resources and sources. And the sectoral design of this geographic sector builds on the taxonomy proposed recently proposed by Antonio. A word of the methodology, and I'll spare you basically the terms of the equation in matrix term that, I mean, I will not need sort of go into dissect the methodology that we use for this paper, but basically to convey the general idea, whenever one does estimate for the for multipliers in a sort of a traditional sense and relying on the traditional mostly widely used DF multipliers, one basically takes into account just the technical condition of production. If instead one wants to rely on a different sort of framework, such as one drawing on the sort of classical political economy one, like here I mentioned a couple of authors such as Kurz, Maiolis, and Rosaris and others. Basically, one will have to take into account, one could take into account also other factors such as income distribution, the relevance of import penetration, basically, and this is really the novelty of of this methodology that we have used for our paper. Also, the trade pattern. So basically, what we did in this paper, we estimate the set of multipliers taking into account of the property of this methodology. A word on sort of the first part of the result in terms of data that sort of help to capture sort of the technological so where the main sectors in Africa are located in terms of intra-sectoral demand and supply. So this is the classical sort of taxonomy that one can compile one estimated backward and forward linkages. So, I mean, obviously you have this four quadrants, and then, as you can clearly see from this picture, those, the sort of the main aggregate sector for the region are mostly located in this bottom left quadrant, which, what we call it the dead valley in the sense. Because in this, what is basically graph is telling you that those sector tends to be relatively independent with respect to the economy itself, and in generally with respect to the average of the other sector in the rest of the world. Meaning that basically, their connection both in terms of both in backward sense and in forward sense are relatively weak with respect to the average figures that one can compute from the world average, let's say. And this is also true to most of the sort of the manufacturing sectors, with a slight difference with the difference of the high-tech sector, which even though it kind of a high sort of does demand inputs from other sectors.
it does still fail to locate into this magical, I would say, right hand upper quadrant, meaning that it's in a situation where this both a provider and inputs, and it does demand more inputs from other sectors of the economy. So the idea here is to sort of locate the internal technological backwardness of those sectors and of the manufacturing sector in particular for this region. So, I mean, a slight, so there's a very different taxonomy, which is maybe less common in this sort of input-output analysis framework, which is comparing, measuring the intra-regional and inter-regional backward and forward link. So what does it mean in particular? So here we are measuring instead how much of those linkages are locally created, and what's the share of this locally sources or locally produced, and what's the share that instead is sources abroad. So in practical terms, this figure in practical terms, if you are located in the sort of the dead valley, in the dead valley that is in the lower left hand quadrant, then it means that you are kind of falling in a sort of an export led, but also in a sort of an import dependent model. Meaning that you're not just using most of your value chain, you're not just demanding more than the sort of the global average inputs from the rest of the world, but you're also selling most of your input towards the rest of the world. And this is true basically for all of the sort of main macro sector, including manufacturing. Though the sector, the service, the tertiary sector does fall into a completely opposite category, which is kind of the regular empirical style and spark that one can find across several topics. But obviously, then if you want to focus at you asked me to slow down, and then I have to accelerate. So, but then, yeah. No, I mean, yeah. Okay. Yeah, anyways. So I think I just, I mean, and then I think I just think that the simulation setup. So basically what we did, we use informative data to construct employment. And in particular, we combine, we use as a target for our program, the combine unemployment and the potential labor force rate provided by the IDAN. And then we set the wage rate above the 3 poverty lines designed by the World Bank. It doesn't, I mean, here in this case, we are simply looking for some benchmark. That doesn't mean that the benchmark will be higher or it could be adjusted in a different way. Same goes for the targeted population. As for the sector involved in this program, then as you can see here, usually, I mean, since if one wants to take infrastructural transition test, then there are a number of sectors included into the manufacturing and the high-tech manufacturing time that that are really relevant for your construction of your and the estimation of your total cost. So that's why you may want to have a look at the impact of that your sector, the construction of your sector can have on the sources of input that then will demand from across these industries. And we run basically 4 kinds of scenarios. So the first one is basically the equivalent Keynesian demand stimulus equaling the cost of the job guarantee program, that is the wage bill plus this infrastructural spending related to the investment on this sector, with no structural changes implied.
effect. And the second scenario is sort of the traditional sort of job guarantee one, in which this program is implemented with the baseline, and then with this sort of the baseline wage rate and the starting population that is estimated that is augmented unemployment rate, including sort of the underemployment. Then the third one is kind of the sort of the regional integration shift, where where there is an adjustment of trade pattern by sort of decreasing the linkages from the rest of the world. So before the linking, using the word that they used in the previous presentation, and increasing by the same token the linkages with the other south region, that is the Latin American one. And finally, scenario 4 is there is this strengthening of local value chains, in which sort of we double with we double the strength of local interdependent industry, and as well as maintaining this property of your ending strategically trade among South lands. So as we can get is mostly that basically in sort of the Keynesian demand stimulus we still get a sort of an important sort of result in terms of growth rate. But in terms of employment, direct sort of the traditional sort of Keynesian sort of stimulus, we do get only an increase by 10%, which is less than the fact that this would have required to sort of absorb the population, the unemployed, increase unemployment and unemployment rate estimated by the ILO. Whereas, if I'm for a direct job creation program will grant you a higher growth rate, and roughly in a minute, the scenario, and will also give you a second round effect in terms of additional sort of demand created, sort of via multiplier effect. And though it will still generate a demand for even a larger demand for import, especially maintaining sort of constant the pattern of trade. But then if we follow the results from scenario 3 and scenario 4, which sort of redesign value chain, both to relax the external constraint and increase sort of the absorption of local industry of local industry, then you see that you don't get just a better input in terms a better response in terms of growth rate, but also you decrease dramatically sort of you decrease input growth and maintaining sort of constant or even decreases by a big import penetration. So just sort of to wrap up the presentation. Basically, the geography sort of perform a standard stimulus. I mean, because you get higher growth and much stronger sort of job creation. With basically maintaining with basically the same cost, because it's exactly this that's why we selected this threshold of $10 in the first place, because basically we got the size of the GDP in 2000 the government expenditure as a share of GDP in the region in 2019. So in terms of from a fiscal perspective, is far more sort of efficient. Though this gives you also room and space to rethink also to how to restructure a regional interregional value chain in a sort of fostering this sort of South India. So I'm done.
I've been getting some signals from Longo that we only have 8 minutes left. So I think I'll just take only 2 questions. There's one question here and one question here. I do appreciate that, but we can discuss it, the speaker to leave it to break.
Already, yes. Well, my question is directed to Holman, but perhaps the team can attempt to look at. I was just looking at the economic geography of the value chain, right? Nigeria has got 214 million people, Egypt 124 million people, South Africa 66 zero. And so if we look at the spatial distribution of value chains, it's quite an essentially all of it is in South Africa. I think we should be beginning to have strategies. I don't know whether you have developed time and you have T-coin chess. The value chains are waiting to Johannesburg, Abuja, Cairo, and so on. So that at least we address issues of migration and related social benefits. So are there some studies that are out there? Are you guys doing something about that? It's very important.
Can you say your name?
My name is Zakia, who's on my data. I'm not an economist, so please bear with me. Economics that was based on capitalism. They have their world economic systems that we practice, obviously, Africa creates mid-19 some of our indigenous communities. And trade was really based on countries sharing based on needs, you know, and if I had this and you had that, then we can share. I mean, automatically that brings integration because we had 10 independent. I'm just thinking, is it possible, as you are economists, for us to revisit that approach to trade rather than that system which we have been sort of almost, I don't know. We have been trained into understanding economics only through academics led. And I want to go with the case that we can revisit trade and economics based on that original idea as to why we should really based on that.
So, thank you so much. I asked Holman to start this specific question related to
Thank you, Rich. So the value chains as they exist at the moment tend to be lumpy. And they are concentrated on economic hubs. So if you take Southern Africa, particularly, South Africa accounts for almost 67% of the total imports and much lower in terms of export from the region. And then you can go to West Africa, also Nigeria, and then East Africa, Kenya, and North Africa. North Africa is a little bit more heavily distributed. And so that then presents us with the problem of how do we then, because if we continue with interpreting the continent that way within an equal one, it will create resentment. Already in Southern Africa, there's a lot of resentment with South Africa community. South Africa has a huge trade surplus with the rest of the region because of the economic powers. So in terms of theorizing regional valuation, there's a suggestion that we then adopt what we call a regional division of labor based on an equitable and fair distribution of the gains from trade. Because if we go with the global value chains are guided by markets. And markets will always be, will always give us an equal distribution. So within the regional value chain, you then design a regional industrial policy, which we have decided, which we have in ECOWAS, which we have in the PCA, not in the. And then within that regional industrial policy, then you begin to rationalize the creation and the sharing of the regional value. Because remember, what I was saying earlier is that the idea of regional value is that you local for the creation or the additional value and the capture value. At the moment, we haven't done so the creation of value takes place in Europe, in China, and they capture. So we don't have that, but when we capture, when we localize and capture that, we have to have a mechanism where we then say, how do we share this? One of the ways to consider relative reduction complementarity, where you say, okay, which country will produce garments better? And then you link those collective activities together within the regional frame. Within the AU, there is this understanding that these regional managers can actually create what we call collective prosperity, which in the Lagos plan of action would get plus collective self-reliance. So the idea is there that not implemented. And one of the reasons for this, I said in the paper, I give a little bit more examples on the fact that the current regional value chains are driven by private sector. So the policy at the level of the national, but also the regional level, has not been implemented. So we haven't actually come up with the regional division of labor based on a equitable share of it. Very quickly. When I did a lecture at Roby in 1999, it says East African community was being created. And I said, the biggest problem in the breakup initially, there were some political tensions on this, was in fact the inequitable nature of industrialization. That in fact, Kenya was dominating, was undermining the possibility of industrialization in Tanzania. And I said to them, I said, instead of focusing on free trade, why are you not actually focusing on industrial policy that creates each of the three countries a good, which will take advantage of the economies of scale of the market as a whole, while creating equitable industrialization, equitable job distribution. And they looked at me like with their mouths wide, because they hadn't heard about this idea. Well, and then roughly 12 years later, we come up with very flawed industrial policy plans. So in that sense, it can be done. And the idea of sharing and producing goods that you want to trade for has to be deliberately created. Not only just from that issue, but also for a variety of reasons, for the politics of these relationships. And that's forgotten. And again, it's they just keep, as they said, everywhere across the country, just go back to the original problematic conceptualization. Let's just open up free trade and everything else. It's very, and this is why we're here discussing this. This is one of the key reasons. That's so important. Thanks.
I agree with the speakers.
Thank you very much, everyone, for all of you that please, because of me.
What is next?
I like the challenges, but also the
Break now.
Industrialization and climate change, and us getting data on how job areas can actually help us overcome all the challenges.
Do we have one? I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. So we now have a 10 minutes before heading to the last session. So we're gonna have after the break like a 3 breakout sessions about money in regional payments